Welcome to the basic platformer section of this course. In this section, we're going to be learning how to make a basic platformer that's based on the hit web game that was made quite a while ago. There was a hit web game with over 12 million plays that's called This Is the Only Level. And the first thing we want to do before we start making our platformer game is create a new project. Now, you probably already know how to do that, but just in case you forgot, you can go to the three bars on the top left, then click it, then go to File, Create, and Create New Empty Project. Now, specifically for this project, we're going to be using a custom size, but it's not too serious because you can always change it later. But we're going to be using a custom size of a screen, which is 800 by 600, and then from there you can name it whatever you want. I want you to also put optimize for pixel art, and do not allow the player to authenticate in-game because not multiplayer. And remember, one last thing, when you're creating your project, make sure to save your project in a folder. So create a folder for your project and a place where you can remember it, and then save your project in a folder. Do not save your project anywhere on your file system without putting it in a folder. It can junk up your computer because the files will be everywhere. But I already made a project, so you can just create it here. But I'm going to cancel, and you should be greeted with this blank project. So how do we make a platformer character? It's really simple in GDevelop. All we have to do is add a new object, and we're going to create a basic sprite object. Then we're going to name this object player. And of course, you can name it whatever you want, but generally you want to name it player, not just something goofy or something completely random. So I'm going to import an image, and here you should go to wherever you save your downloadable assets. I saved them on my desktop, but go to wherever you save them, and then go into your cut elephant sprites and double click sprite 0, and then click OK. And you should have this single elephant sprite. It'll just be standing still. Now, how do we make our player act like a platformer character? Are we going to have to use a bunch of events? We do not have to use a bunch of events. All we have to do is go into our behaviors tab, which is our first time using it in this course. So we're going to go into the behaviors tab, and then we're going to add a behavior. And all that behavior is a set of pre-programmed events where we don't have to program them onto that character or that player or that object. They're already pre-programmed for us, and all we have to do is add it to our object. These are GDevelop's default ones that are built into GDevelop. So we have a bunch of behaviors, but we want to go into this one that says platformer character, and we're going to click this. Now, before we get overwhelmed with all of these different settings, because there are a lot of settings for our platformer object, we're just going to hit apply first and see what this does. So we're going to click into our player and then drag it onto our scene view. And now let's preview and see what happens to our character. Now, the first thing that you'll see will happen is that your player will immediately start falling into an endless void. It's still falling, but we can't see it right now. But it just keeps falling. And that's the good thing, because now we know that our player is actually working. Our behavior is working. Now we need to add a platform that our player can stand on so we can start moving and exploring the different behaviors in the next part, or the different aspects of the behavior in the next part. So before we get into the next part, we're going to add a new object first, and we're going to call this, well, we're going to make it a sprite, and we're going to call this object ground. You could call it platform, whatever you want. Let's make sure it makes sense. Then we're going to import an image, and once again, go into where you save your sprites, and then we're going to double click into this green ground. And I'm going to click it now, and you'll see that we have a ground. Now, if I hit apply, and then drag it onto the scene, and then I can click it and then stretch it out using these nodes. And if I preview this now, we'll still have an issue. Our player will completely fall through the ground, and that's because we have to add a platform behavior to our ground object. So we're going to double click into our ground, then we're going to go into behaviors, and then add a behavior. And we want to add the platform behaviors. And this is specifically made for the platformer object. So make sure that when you're ever using this platform behavior, it needs to be compatible with your object. You need to make sure that your object has a platformer behavior before you start using this. So we have this option, ledges can be grabbed. We're going to uncheck that because we're not going to be using that for an elephant. But we have also different types of platforms that we'll get into later. But right now we're going to keep it a basic platform. And we're going to hit apply. And now when I preview, our player will not fall through the ground anymore, and we can actually stand on it. Now, how do you move your player around? Now, this uses the default controls, which we will learn how to change later. It's not that hard. But you can use the arrow keys on your keyboard, up, down, left, and right, and you can start moving around. And if you want to jump, you can also press space, and now you can jump. And that's how you make a basic platformer object that can stand on ground. Now, in the next part, we're going to be analyzing and learning about the different parts of the platform behavior. Welcome back. In this part, we're going to be analyzing and learning about the different properties that are part of the platformer behavior. Now, in order for us to analyze these and look at these, all we have to do is double click into our player and then go back into our behaviors tab. Now, do not get overwhelmed or threatened by these simple features. This is not complicated at all. This is very simple. And we don't even need to go through all of these because this is the only level. It's a pretty basic platformer game, so we're not going to be using all the features for this course, especially since it's a basic platformer. We're not going to need all of these anyway. So let's start from the top. We have the default controls, and the default controls is what we are using earlier to move around. By default, this behavior will let us move using the arrow keys. Now, if I uncheck the default controls and hit apply, if I try to preview it now, I will not be able to move using the arrow keys, and I will no longer be able to jump by pressing space. This is because the default controls are off, and we're going to learn how to make different controls later on in this part of the course. So we're going to X out, and we're going to set back on our default controls for now. Now, gravity is pretty self-explanatory, just like real life. The higher the gravity is, the faster your player will fall towards the ground, and the so-called heavier it will be. So if you set this gravity as being equal to 2,000, which is double of what it used to be, we're going to hit apply once again, and now we're going to preview. And you see if we jump, if I press space, my object is acting much heavier. It feels like it's heavier now. It's falling to the ground much faster, and I'm not jumping as high as I did before. So that's basically what gravity is. Now, we're going to go back into our behavior, and something that goes hand in hand with gravity is the jump speed. Now, I actually don't like the name jump speed, because more accurate, this can be described as jump force. So the higher this jump speed or jump force is, I'm just going to say jump force, that makes more sense. The higher the jump force is, the higher your character will jump. Keep in mind, this does not change the gravity. Your player will still fall toward the ground extremely fast if you have high gravity. But if you have a jump speed that's high, you'll still be able to jump very high while keeping a heavy object. So let's say I set this gravity as being equal to 10,000, which is really big. And then I hit apply, and then I preview and try to jump. You'll see that I only jump a little bit, and I'm moving immediately right back to the ground. Now, if I go back into my player and then go into behaviors, and I make my jump speed 5,000, which is really high, I'm probably going to jump out of the screen view, and I hit preview. Now if I press space, I jump super high. But I also still fall toward the ground quite fast. Now, of course, if you're making a platformer game, you will not be using extremely high values like this unless you're trying to make a really unique game. So I'm going to set this gravity back to 1000, set the jump speed back to default, which is 600. Now, we have maximum falling speed, and this is self-explanatory. The maximum fall speed, it sets a cap on how fast your player can fall. That's why, even though our gravity was high, as you just saw earlier, we still weren't falling toward the ground extremely fast because there was a maximum fall speed. So if you want to make your player drop down really fast if it's falling from a really big height, you can set this maximum fall speed as something really big. You can set it to be something really big. So now if I set my gravity back to 10,000 and I set my jump speed back to 500, well 5,000, if I hit apply now, you'll see that I'll move toward the ground much faster than I did last time. So if I hit space, I jump super high in the air and it immediately falls back down because now our maximum fall speed is no longer limited. Now, as a general practice, you can set this really to wherever you want. This is all dependent on your game, but normally games do have a maximum falling speed for their players. So I recommend you set it to something that matches your game. And honestly, I like the default at 700. But like I said, make it something that matches your game. And I'm going to set the gravity back to 1000 and the jump speed back to 600. Now, jump to sustain time. This may seem a little bit complicated. Jump sustain time is not complicated. Now, first, I'm going to start by setting this to 0. And basically, I'm going to explain jump sustain time. Jump sustain time allows you to have a variance in your jump. And what I mean by variance, if you hold the jump key longer, you'll jump higher. And if you press it for a short period of time, you won't jump as high as you did when you held the jump key. So, if I set the jump sustain time to 0, no matter if we hold space or we just press it, it'll always jump the same height. So let's hit apply and preview this and test it out. If I hit space regularly, it jumps this height. This is me holding space. Now if I press it, I just lightly pressed it, it's still jumping the exact same height because the jump sustain time is 0. Now let's set the jump sustain time as being something a little bit higher than 0, 0.4. Let's put 0.4 as our jump sustain time. And let's hit apply. If I preview this now, if I hold space, you'll see that I'll have a pretty high jump. But if I just simply press space, my jump is much lower. And it's kind of similar to the jump that we just saw. So this allows you to have variance in your jump. Now, one thing that's pretty wacky, but it's also pretty cool if you want to make a little glide mechanic. Now, keep in mind, this is not the proper way to make a glide mechanic. But if you set the jump sustain time as being really, really, really high. Let's say I set the jump sustain time as being 5,000, extremely high value. If I hit apply and then preview, if I hold space, I can kind of just float because the jump is still trying to sustain that jump force. It's still trying to sustain it. But once again, unless you're trying to make a low budget glide feature for your game, you wouldn't be doing this, but it's still kind of cool to know. So I'm going to double click our player once again, go into behaviors. Honestly, I like the jump sustain time of being close to 0.4, but I'm going to make it slightly lower, 0.3. You can set this to whatever you want to tweak the game. Now, ladder climbing speed, we're not going to get into this in the basic platformer part because our elephants are not going to be climbing ladders. Especially if you played the game, you know that there are no ladders in that game. We're not going to worry about grabbing onto ledges. Once again, the player does not grab onto ledges. And we also don't have animations to even support that. So we're going to uncheck automatically grab platform ledges. Now we have some more important things. And these are the last things we're going to be dealing with. The advanced properties, there's not anything in here. This is just old functionalities that we don't want to check on. Now, back to topic. We have 4 more things that we need to cover. Well, actually 3 more because we're not going to have slopes in our game. There are no slopes and this is the only level. But 3 more things we need to cover is acceleration, deceleration, and max speed. Now, acceleration and deceleration, you probably already know what this is. The higher your acceleration is, the faster your player will get to its max speed. So, our max speed right now is 250. Let's set it as being a little bit higher. Let's set it as being double of what it was, which is 500. Now, we're going to keep the acceleration the same, 1,500 right now, and hit apply. If I preview this, if I just press the right arrow key, you'll see that I slowly get into the max speed. Well, not slowly, but I go into my max speed quite quickly, but it's not instant. It's not instant. So it's pretty fast, but you can see I'm also sliding around because my deceleration is not instant. Now, if I double click back into the player, if you want your player to move more snappily, and what I mean by snappily, it'll instantly get to its max speed, and it'll instantly stop when you stop pressing any keys. You want to use a high acceleration and a high deceleration. For example, I say go to 10,000. 10,000 is enough to produce that instant movement and the instant stopping. So we're going to set the acceleration and deceleration to be equal to 10,000. And now if I hit apply and preview this, you'll see that I immediately get to my max speed, and when I stop pressing a button, I immediately stop. There's no delay at all. And this is great for this the only level because in this is the only level, the movement is quite snappy. I don't think it's 100% instant, but it feels like it is. So this is great for replicating the movement of this is the only level. Now, one more thing we're going to do before we leave is double click into our player, go into behaviors, and let's just set the max speed as being back equal to 250. I like that value. Once again, you can change it if you want, but those are the basic properties of the platform behavior that we're going to be using for our remake or different version of This Is the Only Level. Welcome back. In this part, we're going to be learning how we're going to change our controls. Let's say we want to move using the WASD type of preset. WASD, and basically we're only going to be using A and D, and then using space to jump. How would you do that if you want to do it? Now, you don't have to do that, but it's a good thing to know. And another thing that we're going to be doing in this part is we're going to be learning how we can flip our player. And what I mean by flipping the player, if we preview this, if we move around, If I move right, okay, that's pretty cool. But if I move left, the player is still facing right. So we have to flip our player so its direction that it's facing matches the direction in which it's moving. So let's get into changing our default controls. Now the first thing we want to do is double click into our player and then click into behaviors. And then you can go into the default controls and uncheck that. Now you will not be able to move with the arrow keys and you will not be able to jump by pressing space. So now let's go into our events. Now we have a blank set of events and let's add a new event. Now we're trying to move right by pressing D and we're trying to move left by pressing A. And let's say we want to jump by pressing W. So we don't have to press space. We want to create an entire new preset. How do we do that? Now first, remember, we can, in GDevelop is so simple and straightforward that we can use English and then convert it into events in real time. And what do I mean by this? What I want to do, if the D key is pressed, I want to make the player move right. Basically, I want to simulate the right movement if the D key is pressed. So let's do that. Remember, if is our condition. So if the D key is pressed, so we're going to add a condition and go into our other conditions. And you should remember this from the Pong. But if you forgot, you can go into your other conditions, go into keyboard, and then go into key pressed. And when you go into key press, you'll have a whole set of keys, all the keys on the keyboard. But all you have to do is type D. Make sure it's lowercase. Don't do anything related to the numpad, but make sure it's D. So now that's the first part of our statement. If the D key is pressed, now we want to simulate the right movement of our player. So now let's go into our actions. Now, this is something you have to learn from getting comfortable with GDevelop. But since we're trying to access something that's on the platform of behavior, we will not be looking to other actions. We're trying to access a movement on the platform of behavior. So we're not going to be looking in here. Remember, the platform of behavior is on our player object. So first we're going to click into our player, and then we can scroll down, and you've probably never used it before. So you have to scroll down and go into where it says platformer controls. And in this section, you'll see all the simulations of simulating the different actions on the platform of behavior. And we're trying to simulate the right key press. So down here near the bottom, we have simulate right key press. Then we can click this and click OK. Now we go and preview this and we see what happens. If I press D, you see that my player now moves to the right. But we still can't move to the left and we still can't jump. So we need to do something similar just with different key presses. So the next one, if the A key is pressed, now we want to simulate pressing left for the player. So since this is similar, we don't have to go add a whole new event and then go through the menus. It's faster to just click the event first. You can either click a blank part like this or click the side, then right click it, and then you can click copy. Or you could just put Control C as a keyboard shortcut. Then you can right click again, and then you can put paste, or you can put Control V, and now you have the pasted command. So remember, whenever you have the colored letters or the colored words, that means you can edit it without double clicking into the condition or the action. So I can click into D, and then I can change this to A, and then I can go into my player, and I can keep that the same. But we do need the double click here. We do need the double click into our action because remember, it's still simulating the right key press. Now we want to simulate the left key press right here. So now let's hit OK, and let's read it again. If the A key is pressed, then we want to simulate pressing left for the player. So now we're going to preview and see if it works. So now we're going to preview. If I press A, I move left. If I press D, I move right. So everything is working correctly. And we're going to copy and paste this event one more time. And we're going to do the same thing, but for jumping. So I'm going to right click this event, copy, right click again, and paste. And we're going to change this A key to be the W key. Because let's say in English again, if the W key is pressed, then we want to simulate the jump for the player. So now we're going to double click into our action. We're going to double click here, and we can scroll up, and we see that we have simulate the jump key press. So simulate jump key press and click OK. Now if we preview this, I can use WASD, and I can use the arrow keys. Not WASD. I can just use WASD. I said the arrow keys for no reason. But I can use D to move right, A to move left, and I can use W to jump. So now we have that working, and that's how you effectively change your controls to be other than default. So now that we've learned how to do that, that's a great accomplishment, great achievement. Give yourself a round of applause, and make sure to also save your project while you're doing that. But save your project. But now we have to get into flipping our player. And it's not a complicated process where we have to use mathematics and calculus and trigonometry and things like that. It's extremely simple to flip the player. Now, basically, let me say it in English first, and now we're going to convert into events. So if our D key is pressed, we want to flip our player in the right direction. And if the A key is pressed, we want to flip the player in the left direction, or the opposite direction of what it used to be. Now, of course, you've never used all the actions for this, so I'm going to show you it for the first time, and then you'll be able to do it yourself. So, we already have the condition for if the D key is pressed. So we actually don't have to add a new event here. We can just use this event and add another action. So we already have if the D key is pressed, so we're going to add an action. And we want to flip our player horizontally. So we're going to click into our player, and if you scroll down, you should eventually see something that says flip the object horizontally. Now, you'll see something that says activate flipping. And activate flipping, we don't want to use it for the right direction because we're not trying to flip it. And what do I mean by we're not trying to flip it like that? We're still flipping the player, but it's not flipping in the opposite direction of what it originally was. Now, I know that probably didn't make any sense, but let me explain it. If I go into my untitled scene, a great name for a scene, by the way, but you'll see this is the default orientation of our player. By default, it's facing right. And basically, whenever you have a sprite object, or any object for that matter, whenever you're trying to flip it in the direction in which it is by default, you always want to put no on the activate flipping part. It's still going to flip it if you're facing left, but it's not going to flip it again if you're already facing in that direction. I hope that makes sense. But basically, if you're facing right by default, you don't want to flip it horizontally when you're pressing right. So that's the simplest way I can explain it here. So now that we have that, you're not going to see any changes yet. So let's add another action for the if the A key is pressed. Now, if the A key is pressed, we want to flip the player horizontally. So we're going to go into the action here. We're going to go into the action here. And we're going to click into the player. And once again, scroll down into where it says flip the object horizontally. And then for activate flipping, you want to put yes. Because now we're flipping in a direction that is not the default direction, which is right. We're trying to flip left. So now we want to actually activate the flipping mechanic. So I'm going to click OK. And if I preview, if I press D, it's going to still be facing right. And if I press A, it's still going to be facing left. And if I press D, it'll face right again. Press A, it'll face left again. And that's how you do flipping for your controls. That's how you do flipping, and that's also how you change the default controls for your player. Welcome back. In this part, we're going to be learning about how to add animations to our player. Now, so far in this course, we haven't did anything at all related to animating any objects. So we're going to learn how to add animations to our player right now. So of course, the first thing we're going to do, obviously, is double click into our player. And if we double click into our player, we want to stay in the properties tab. There's no animations tab. And that's because when we make a sprite, it technically already has an animation. And that animation doesn't have a name by default. By default, it's named animation number 0. And if you don't name it, the only way you can access it in the event system is by using the event number. Not event number, using the animation number. But we want to use an animation name instead of an animation number. Now, you could call it, of course, from a number, but it's better and easier to read your events when you call your animations using names. So the first thing you want to do is go into your animation name, and you'll see that it will light up when you scroll over it. You can click it, and then we're going to call this one idle. We're going to call idle. As general practice, don't name it something like idle animation, because it will still work, but it's just unnecessarily long for no reason. So that's our idle animation, and we're going to add one more animation for this part. And I'm going to add an animation, and once again, we're going to name this one run, because we're going to be running soon using our animation system. And I'm going to add a sprite, and then I go into our cut elephant sprites. Now, let's say this is our run animation right here. This is our run animation. Now, you could just double click this, each one by one, and add all of the frames, but that'll take kind of long. Even though it doesn't take that long, it still takes longer than doing this method. Now, the faster method is just to click the first object or the first file, and then hold shift on your keyboard, and then click the last one. And then all of them will be lit up, and then you can click open. And if I import them, you'll see all of them will immediately display at the same time. And now we have 2 animations. Now, one more thing, we have some settings when it comes to animations. If I press loop on this, this means that the animation will loop. And our running is supposed to loop. So we want to check on the loop. And now we want to preview it. If we preview, this is the running animation. And I know it looks a little bit awkward, but that's actually how the elephant runs in the game. That's the running animation. So it's tilting back and forth. Now this is kind of slow because when we're running, we want it to be faster. Now there's 2 ways you can change the speed. You can either go up on the FPS. The FPS is how many frames it is cycling through per second. Or you can use this timer of how long it takes between each frame to be played. Now the better method, I'd say, is FPS. All you have to do is make it go up. And then if you replay it to rerun it, you'll see that it's now moving faster. And I kind of like that speed. I'm going to move it a little bit lower to 18. And now we have replay. And this is a pretty good running animation speed. You can change this whenever you want. You can zoom into your animation using this slider. You can zoom out using this slider. You can even go into fitting the context in the window. Fit the content to the window, not the context. But if you zoom in and then click this, it'll automatically zoom out to a point where it's fitting again. So I'm going to pause this, and I'm going to hit OK, and I'm going to hit apply. And that's how you add animations and change the animation speed of your objects. Welcome back. In this part, we're going to be learning how to animate our elephant character so it has an idle animation and a running animation. Now, on the last part, we already made the elephant have both of these animations set up. So if we double click into our player, we'll see that animation 0 is idle, and animation 1, or 2 you could call it, is the running animation. And that's kind of important, that animation 0, if you're calling these animations in the events using numbers, this one, even though it's the first one, it wouldn't be 1. It would be 0. And even though this is the second animation, you would have it 1. Basically, when it comes to GDevelop animation numbers, the first number is 0 and not 1. But we're not calling them by numbers anyway, so it doesn't really matter that much. Now I'm going to hit apply, even though we didn't change anything. Now, the first thing we need to do is figure out how we're going to make our event system work, where if we're moving, our player will be in his running animation, and if we're not moving, we'll be in idle. Because this is actually quite simple to make, so let's click into our untitled scene events right here, and we can just say it in English. Because the reason why we're doing the animations like this is because in the game, this is the only level. If you played it, I encourage you to play it since that's what we're remaking. Basically, the player, no matter if you're in the air or not, as long as you're moving, you'll automatically be in the running animation. And if you're not moving, you'll automatically be in the idle animation. So that's how we're going to do it. So all we have to do is check if our horizontal speed of the player is greater than 0, or if it's not 0, then we want to be in our running animation. And if the horizontal speed of the player is 0, then we're going to be in our idle animation. I'm going to say it once again more clearly. If the horizontal speed of our player is 0, we want to change our animation to idle. And if the horizontal speed of our player is not 0, then we're going to make our animation equal to run. So let's add these 2 events. So let's add an event, and we already know the if statement, if the horizontal speed of the player is 0. So we're going to go into our conditions, and since we're trying to access something on the player, we're going to click into our player. Now, you may be wondering, okay, where's the horizontal speed? We can check it right here in the platformer state section, and you'll have current horizontal speed. And we want to check if the current horizontal speed of the player is equal to, because we have the sign of the test, we want to make sure this is equal, and then set it if it's equal to 0. So this right here is our condition, or our if statement. Now we need the action, and we remember the action is our animation is supposed to be then set to idle. So we can set animations up pretty easily, so let's add an action. And the way that you set up an animation is you click into the object that you want to animate, and then you click into it, and then you scroll down until you find the animation section. Or you can type it in the search bar up here and type in animation, but I like using this menu. So we're going to scroll down, and now we can play animation by number or by name. So playing an animation by number, remember, the first one is actually 0. So if we want to call the idle animation by number, we could just put 0. But a simpler and easier way to read it in the events is calling animations by their name. So we can click into animation by name, and then you can see we can right now have the animation name, and we could just type in the animation name using 2 quotations to show that it's a text type of name, and we could type in idle, and that'll work. But an easier way to do it is click on here on the right and click select an animation, and then you can have a drop down menu which you can choose between from, and you don't have to remember each one of the names. So that's the best way to do it. It's even better than the numbers. So we're going to set the animation name to be equal to idle. Now if we preview, nothing is going to change at all because we are already in our idle animation by default. By default, you'll always be in your animation index 0 by default. So right now our player is still not going to change animations at all. So now let's make the running condition and action. So remember, if the current horizontal speed of the player is not 0, then we want to change our animation of the player to be set equal to run. So let's do this all over again. Let's add a condition. Let's click into our player, and then we scroll down until we find the platform state and check the current horizontal speed. Now we could do this if we have sign of test. We also have a not equal to sign of test. So now we're saying if the current horizontal speed of the player is not equal to 0. So that's the condition you want. Make sure that this equal sign has a cross between it. That way you know that it says not equal to. And now let's change the animation of our player to be set equal to run. So let's add an action, click into our player, and let's scroll down to the animations tab. Scroll down to the animations tab and change the animation by name. Once again, we have this menu already set up and we want to set it equal to run now. And let's click OK. And let's preview this now. And let's see if it works. If I press D, I'll move to the right, and you'll see that I'm now in my walking animation. And funnily enough, this is actually how the walking animation looks in the game as well. This is how the running animation looks. Now if I press W to jump, this is how it also works in the game. If our horizontal speed is 0, no matter if we're jumping, we're still not going to be in that running animation. But as long as we start moving, we'll automatically be in the running animation, which is completely accurate to how it is in the game. So that is how you set up a simple animation state system in GDevelop. Welcome back. Now we're just about halfway done making this basic platformer based on this is the only level. We made the platformer controller with our character, even with the basic animations, and now it's time to learn how we make our levels. Now, making levels, there's a specific way that you should be making levels, because you can already see by now, if we want to make a level, normally what you may think if you don't know anything about making levels in GDevelop yet, you would think that we're just going to have to click this, we could right click it and duplicate it and drag it around. But of course, this is the most inefficient way to make a level and the sloppiest way to make a level, because you cannot make these exactly match up. Like let's say I want to make these little cubes of levels, of platforms, and I want this one to be 100% 100% spaced out, evenly spaced out. If I want to make a bunch of these evenly spaced out, it wouldn't work. It would not work at all, because I'll have to keep manually changing each one of the values to try and make it evenly spaced out, and it would take forever. Now, a slightly better way to make levels, still not the best way to make levels, is by using GDevelop's grid system. And to access GDevelop's grid system is very easy. All you have to do is go around here in the top right, and you'll see that we have something that looks like a tic-tac-toe board, and then you'll see toggle/edit grid. You can click that, and then you want to put show grid. And when you show grid, you'll see that now we have a grid that pops up. Now, naturally and normally, your grid, each one of these grid spaces, they will be 32 by 32 pixels. And you can actually change that if you want to. You can go back up to your grid, click it, and then set up the grid. And you can change the grid offset, which normally you don't want to be messing with it. You can make it isometric. We're not making an isometric game. But more importantly, you can change the cell width and you can change the cell height. Of course, for most games, you want to keep these the same, but depending on what tiles you're using, this is definitely useful to change these to be different. And then you also have the line color. And the line color can also be pretty cool to change, but right now that blue color is just fine for us right now. So I'm going to hit apply. Now, you can make levels better by using the grid system. Because let's say I drag this ground onto the scene, and naturally this ground is 32 by 32 pixels. If I click it, you'll see that its width and its height are 32 by 32. And then I could duplicate it. I could right click on it, then duplicate it, and then I can drag it out and it'll evenly space around the grid. Now this is much faster and much more clean than the other method we talked about, but it's actually still not the best way to make a level. The best way to make a level is by using GDevelop's tile map system, and that's what we're going to be learning in this part. So now how do we access GDevelop's tile map system? Well, first we have to actually create a tile map object. So if I add a new object, If I scroll down, you'll see that we have a tile map object right here. It displays a tile-based map. And if I click this, you'll see that we have the object name. We're just going to call this ground tile map. Doesn't really matter what you name it. And the tile size, remember, our ground is 32 by 32 pixels. That means our tile size should be 32. That's what it should be. So I'm going to type in 32. And then the atlas image. This is for your tile map. Now, you may be familiar with tile maps. You may not. If you did anything related to game development before, you may or may not be familiar with tile maps. But basically, a tile map is just a big map of the tiles in your game. And most of the time, they're around the same size. 32 by 32, 64 by 64, so on and so forth. But right now, for a game like this, we only need one image on our atlas, which is that cube that we had earlier, which we remember 32 by 32 pixels. So I'm going to choose a file, and actually we can go to our green ground right here. You can just click your green ground because it's already loaded inside of the assets in the game. So I can click it, and another thing is you can configure the tiles hitboxes. And this is important because if you don't configure the tiles hitboxes, whether you set a collision on them or not, you're just going to go through them because it's going to act like it doesn't have a hitbox. So you can click on it, and you'll know that it's configured because now you'll see a kind of reddish orange outline on it. And if you click it again, it'll deactivate it, but make sure you click it and that there's an orange and red outline for it. Now, of course, for this tile map, since it's still a platform object, we need to go into our behaviors and add the platform behavior. So let's add a behavior, and then let's click into the platform. And we don't want the ledges to be grabbed, and that's it. It's just a regular platform. So I'm going to hit apply, and I'm going to delete this real quick, just so I can showcase how to use the tile map, which is the best way to make levels. So the first thing we need to do to start using this tile map is we drag it onto the scene. So make sure you click ground tile map, and then drag it onto the scene. And you can drag this anywhere, but it's best to have it outside of the camera range, which is signified by this black outline. So let's drag it outside the outline. And if you want to actually go into the tile map and start building and painting, you can click it. Now the hitbox is not 100% accurate to how this looks, how this little blue thing looks, the checker thing looks. But just scroll over until you click it, until you actually see it outlined. That's what I meant to say. So we have a few options here in our tile map painter. Don't worry about this up here. This is definitely not important for us right now. But this is the main thing, tile map painter, and you'll be able to actually paint your tiles. So of course, the first thing you want to do is if you want to start painting tiles, you can click this paintbrush right here, and you can click it, and you'll see that it's outlined. And now if you go into the scene, now you're using the tile map system. And this is much, much faster because other than that, you'll have to duplicate it. But now I can just click, I can click. And even faster than me clicking is I can just hold it and then drag. I can hold it and drag and paint like that. Now, how do you delete things on your tile map? Also extremely easy. You can just click the eraser tool, and then you can easily delete individual tiles on your tile map. And just by using these two features, you also have these another few features right here. You have this feature where you have a horizontal flip and a vertical flip, but this is not useful for this tile map because since this is a completely even sprite that has no type of artwork on it, it's just all green, it's all a singular color, horizontally flipping it or vertically flipping it won't do anything. So your challenge for this part is to start designing your own level. But in the next part, we're going to be getting into adding some spikes to our level. Welcome back, and now it's time to get into making the spikes for our level. Now, you may be wondering about why I didn't make a super sophisticated level. This level is sophisticated to me. Don't worry about my level, but I did challenge you to make your own level whenever you get the chance. Now, when it comes to adding spikes, you may think that, well, maybe we should just do another tile map thing where we make another tile map for the spikes and then we can easily paint around spikes. And technically that will work, but let me tell you something about when it comes to the hitboxes of this spike. Now, let me add a new object and you can do it yourself, or you can just watch and see how this is going to be. So I'm going to click into tile map, and we're not going to name it because we're going to delete this anyway. We're going to put this tile size at 32 by 32, and I'm going to choose a file from my Atlas images. Now I'm going to choose a file, and then I'm going to go into my desktop, and then I'm going to go into my spike. Now that I have the spike, this is a spike PNG. Now you see that when we configure the tiles hitboxes, let's say I click it, this outline right here, this is the spike's hitbox. And you can now see why this is a major issue. And that is one limitation with GDevelop's tile map. GDevelop's tile maps are quite new, so there's not that much functionality with them. But you cannot change your hitbox to anything other than the size here of your tile size. So because of that, we don't want to make spikes using the tile map system. We will actually have to duplicate them with the grid system earlier, which doesn't take too long, but it's definitely longer than tile map. So that's why we don't use it. Now, you could use it, but just know that your spike will have an unfair hitbox that players will more than likely not like. So we're going to cancel this, and we're going to click cancel, going to right click it, and then delete it. And we're just going to add a spike individually as an object, a regular sprite object instead of a tile map. So I'm going to add a new object, click into sprite, and I'm going to rename this, and I'm going to call it spike. And then I'm going to import an image, and then I'm going to double click my spike that you can find your assets. Now, we don't need any behaviors on the thing. We don't need any animation, so we can just go ahead and hit apply. Now, when it comes to this spike, I'm going to drag this onto the scene. And let me also get out my tile map. And I didn't mention this earlier. If you want to exit out of your tile map, all you have to do is just click the paint and click it so it's not selected, and then click anywhere on the scene, and you'll be able to exit your tile map without painting anymore. Now, back into the lesson. Now, we have this spike object. Now, the spike, and this is the only level, is not bigger than the player. It's not bigger than the player. So we need to make this a little bit smaller. Let's try 16 by 16 as our size. And that's a pretty decent size that I like. Now, since this, when you decide on the size of your spike, now you need to alter the grid. Because right now we're moving around a 16 by 16 pixel spike on a 32 by 32 pixel grid. So we're not getting the accuracy that we need to design levels with this. So once again, we're going to go into the top right, go to toggle/edit grid, and then set up the grid. Now we're going to make the cell width 16, and we're going to make the cell height 16. And now we're going to hit apply. And now if I drag around on my spike, I can accurately place it anywhere that I want. And this is a very good as well, because since 16 is a multiple of 32, I can easily drag it around and it'll still match up with my ground here. So now that we have the spike, if I preview this, once again, making games is not magic, so I'm not just going to magically die when I touch the spike, because I made no events that's going to actually handle that. So if I use my WSD keys, I can walk right through the spike. And we don't want this to happen, since we can walk right through the spike. Now, since we can walk through the spike, what we're going to do is make an event. So we're going to go into our event system, and once again, we can read events in English. What we want to do, if the player is in collision with the spike, then we want to delete the player. It's that simple. So we're going to add a new event, and remember, if, that's our condition. Let's add a condition, and we're going to click into player, and then you can either scroll down or type in collision, but since we already found it right here, we'll just click collision. And then we want to check if the player is in collision with the spike. And you'll have this other option, ignore objects that are touching each other on their edges but are not overlapping. And most of the time you want to keep this as no, but if you want to make a platformer that has a little bit more leniency, you can click yes, and then if you're touching it on edges, you won't die. So actually I'm going to click yes for this, because I want a platformer like this to have a little bit of leniency. Now, once again, the action that we want to choose is deleting the player. So the action, we can click action. Then we can click into the player, since that's what we're trying to delete. And let's type in delete, and automatically it'll pop up. So delete the object, and there's no parameters to configure here, so we're just going to click OK. And now let's preview. So if I preview this, I can run to the spike, and then my player dies. And that's how you make the player death, and that's also how you design levels using the spike. And before we just close out this lesson, once again, if you want to easily design a bunch of spikes on your level, what you can do here is you can right click it and duplicate it. But you'll also see that there's a keyboard shortcut to the right of the duplicate text, and that's Control D. And what you can do is you can just type Control D on your keyboard and keep pressing that, and you can duplicate a bunch of these spikes faster. And also, for some of you all that have advanced mice, or like what they call the gaming mice with macros, you can set a macro on your key that will do Control D. And all you have to do is press a button on your mouse and it'll automatically duplicate it. Another thing, one more thing, is you probably already know because I've taught this before, but if you want to make a spike on a wall, for example, you could just rotate it. You could rotate it either 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 270 degrees, any one of those degrees if you want to make different types of spikes. But that is how you make the player depth, and that's how you design and use spikes in your level. Alright. Welcome to the final part of this basic platformer course. In this part, we're going to be learning how to respawn the player and then the next steps of where you should go to increase your skills and making platformers. Now, this is going to be extremely simple of respawning the player. It's not complicated at all to do a basic respawn, especially for a game if you're making it similar to this is the only level. All you have to do is restart the scene. And I'm going to show you how to do that. Restart the scene. So, to restart the scene, all you have to do is go into the Untitled Scene events. And remember, what happens when our player collides with the spike, not only does it delete the player, we can also make it restart the scene. And to restart the scene, all you have to do is add an action like this. And then you go into other actions because these are special actions that do not relate to our objects. And then we're going to go into the scene, and then we go into change scene. And the name of the new scene is just the same scene that you're in. Anytime you want to restart the scene, there's no specific command for restarting, but all you have to do is change the scene to the one that you're already in, which is called Untitled Scene in this case. And to stop any other paused scenes, we don't have any scenes paused, especially for a simple game like this. There's no scenes that are paused, so we can just keep this as no, and then we hit OK. And if I preview this, if I move around and then I jump or hit the spikes, I immediately respawn and restart the scene. Now, may seem quite rough, and the reason why I'm keeping it rough like this is because when it comes to game development, the best way to learn is by actually making. Now, you'll see that if you look into your downloadable assets, you'll see that you have a pipe. And if you play This Is the Only Level, you'll also see that the elephant, when you die, it spawns out of a pipe. It doesn't just spawn out of thin air, it spawns out of a pipe. So your challenge here is to create not only one level, just create several levels and make the elephant so when it dies, it respawns out of the pipe. And when it completes a level and when it touches a certain object, it goes into a new level. And changing scenes is very easy. This right here is the command for changing a scene. This is the command for changing a scene. And all you have to do is create a new scene, which I'm pretty sure you probably know how to do, but if you've forgotten or if you just don't know, you can go to the project manager. And let's say you want to create a new level. If you've already made a level, the best thing to do is to duplicate the scene that you already have. So I can go into the three little dots right here on the side, and then I can duplicate the scene, and I can just call it level 2. You can name it whatever you want. And if I click into level 2, and let's say I change something really quick. If I change something to make it look different, and then I go back into my Untitled Scene events, and instead of changing the scene, let's say when I die, I move to the next level, which is definitely weird. When I die, I'll change it so I move to level 2 instead. And let's see what happens now. If I crash to the spikes, you'll see that now it changes to level 2. And all you have to do is make a second pipe and make an invisible object, which you've learned how to do in the previous section. But make an object for when you touch it, it changes to the next level. That's your project. I encourage you to share your project when you're completed. I would like to see your completed progress, but if not, that's completely fine. But the whole thing about game development is the best practice is making projects. And I could show you exactly how to make a basic project like this, but you wouldn't really learn much because you didn't have to go through the experience of designing your own level. You didn't have to figure out anything on your own. So I already gave you the steps here of changing to a new scene, restarting your scene. I already gave you the assets, and the rest is up to your creativity. Now, where to go from here after you've created that project? Trust me, I highly recommend you create the project, because if you don't create the project, you really don't get much out of it. But where do you go after this? This is extremely basic platformer. Extremely basic platformer. Now, of course, I could just say you can go to my channel or something like that, which is a helpful resource. I do have a video on how to prototype an advanced platformer. It doesn't include the animations, though. But the next thing you should try to do is try recreating other platforms. For example, something like Super Meat Boy. Something like Super Meat Boy has different physics, and it has more advanced features like wall jumping. The player moves much faster, as wall sliding, and that is covered in an extension that GDevelop already has for advanced platforming. In order to make better platformers, one of the best things to do is remake other games. That's how, me personally, I got better at game development and learned how to make things on my own, is because I looked up other games that were already successful, and then I start trying to remake their features. That's one of the best ways to get better at game development. So that's the last part of the course. Make sure to make that project to improve your skills. And if you have any questions, If you get stuck at any part, make sure to go into the Q&A and you can ask those questions. I'll answer them within 48 hours. So thank you for joining this course, and you are officially even more of a no-code revolutionary.